An orphan saved a stranger from a fire, and years later, he returned the favor in the biggest way imaginable. This isn't just another feel-good story. It's proof that the universe keeps score, even when we think no one is watching. Some call it karma, others destiny. But for Marcus Reed and the man whose life he saved, it was the beginning of a connection that would defy all odds and reveal how a single act of courage can echo across decades. Marcus Reed had nothing. At 12 years old, the Pinewood Children's Home was the only place he could call home after a drunk driver took his parents in a single, devastating moment. While other kids had visitors on Sundays, Marcus sat alone by the window, watching families reunite with temporary goodbyes. But there was one thing that captivated the lonely boy: fire. Not in a dangerous way, but with a respectful fascination. He'd seen its destructive power firsthand in a house fire when he was 9, but also understood its ability to provide warmth and light in the darkest times. Fire took, but it also gave. Marcus understood this duality better than most adults. On a bitter November evening, while returning from his part-time job at the corner store, Marcus noticed the orange glow several blocks away. As he got closer, the unmistakable roar of flames and screams pierced the night air. An apartment building was being consumed by fire, with neighbors gathering in horror as sirens wailed in the distance. Something pulled Marcus toward the chaos instead of away from it. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe something deeper, a sense that he belonged in this moment. As flames licked the third-floor windows and black smoke billowed into the night sky, Marcus heard a woman screaming that someone was still inside. But what Marcus found inside those flames would haunt his dreams for decades to come. The heat hit Marcus like a physical wall as he slipped through the building's side entrance. Smoke immediately stung his eyes and filled his lungs, forcing him to crouch low where the air remained marginally clearer. The rationale part of his brain screamed at him to turn back, but something stronger drove him forward. Perhaps it was the memory of his own parents, who never had a chance to escape their fate. Or maybe it was simply that Marcus understood what it meant to be alone in the world, forgotten when it mattered most. "Hello? Is anyone here?" His voice sounded small against the roar of the flames devouring the building's structure. Crackling wood and shattering glass created a terrifying symphony as Marcus navigated the smoke-filled corridor. The wallpaper bubbled and peeled in the heat, revealing the skeleton of the building beneath. Somewhere, a window exploded from thermal stress, sending a rush of fresh oxygen to feed the hungry flames. The stairwell was a chimney of heat and darkness. Each step upward felt like climbing deeper into hell itself. Twice Marcus stumbled, his hands burning against the scorching metal railing. The sound of his own heartbeat thundered in his ears, nearly drowning out the destruction around him. By the third floor, Marcus's t-shirt was soaked with sweat, his breathing labored and painful. The smoke was thicker here, nearly impenetrable, swirling in ghostly patterns that seemed almost alive. A beam crashed down behind him, blocking his retreat. There was no going back now. The building groaned like a dying beast, its structural integrity compromised more with each passing second. Marcus pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth, though it did little to filter the toxic air. "Help. Please." The voice was so faint, Marcus almost missed it. It came again, weaker this time, a desperate plea floating through the chaos. Following the sound, he crawled toward apartment 3C, where the door hung partially open. Inside, the living room was already consumed by flames, but the voice came from further back. The heat was so intense that Marcus's skin felt tight, as if it might crack and peel away at any moment. Family photos hung on the wall, their edges curling and blackening, snapshots of happiness being consumed by the indifferent flames, a life being erased in real time. Marcus had to turn away, the parallels to his own lost family too painful to contemplate. Time was running out. Parts of the ceiling had begun to collapse, and the floor beneath him groaned ominously with each movement. The carpet had begun to smolder under his feet. In the bedroom, Marcus found him, a man in his 30s, unconscious on the floor near an open window, where he had clearly been trying to escape before being overcome by smoke. His face was streaked with soot, one arm outstretched toward the window, fingertips just inches from potential salvation. With strength born of desperation, Marcus grabbed the man under his arms and began dragging him toward the door. The man was heavy, easily twice Marcus's weight, and Marcus's lungs screamed for clean air. Every muscle in his thin frame protested as he pulled the dead weight across the floor. Twice he nearly collapsed, his vision tunneling to a pinpoint, bright spots dancing before his eyes as his oxygen-starved brain began to shut down. But somehow, he kept moving, inch by excruciating inch. Just a little further, he wheezed, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the unconscious man or himself. Don't give up now. The journey down the stairs was a blur of pain and determination. Each step threatened to be their last as the staircase shuddered beneath them. At one point, Marcus's foot broke through a weakened step, trapping him momentarily. Panic surged through his veins as he yanked his leg free, leaving behind his shoe and a layer of skin. When they finally burst through the side door into the cold night air, firefighters were just arriving. The sudden rush of oxygen made Marcus dizzy, his lungs burning as if he'd swallowed fire itself. He coughed violently, each spasm sending daggers through his chest. Through watering eyes, he helped lay the unconscious stranger on the grass before slipping away into the gathering crowd, unnoticed in the chaos. A paramedic rushed to the man's side, placing an oxygen mask over his face. For just a moment, the man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. His gaze swept across the scene, perhaps searching for his rescuer, but Marcus was already retreating into the shadows. No one saw the orphan boy disappear into the darkness that night. No reporters interviewed him, no officials thanked him. He was a ghost who had appeared and vanished, leaving behind only a life saved. As he limped back toward the children's home, his lungs raw and his body aching, Marcus wondered about the man he'd saved. Did he have a family? Would anyone have mourned him? Would anyone have noticed he was gone? The way no one had noticed Marcus was gone tonight. Back at Pinewood, Marcus slipped in through his usual window, washed the soot from his face, and hid his ruined clothes at the bottom of the laundry bin. By morning, the only evidence of his heroism was the angry red burns on his palms and a persistent cough that would plague him for weeks. When the other children gathered around the TV to watch news reports of the fire, Marcus sat quietly in the back, saying nothing as reporters praised the firefighters for their bravery. What Marcus didn't realize was that he hadn't just saved a life that night. He had set in motion a chain of events that would one day save his own. The universe had been watching, taking careful notes, and someday it would balance the scales in a way that even a boy who had lost everything couldn't imagine. 15 years passed like water through Marcus's fingers. The fire faded into memory, becoming just another story he rarely told, a moment of courage in a life that demanded constant resilience. After aging out of the system at 18, Marcus had cobbled together an existence that most would call modest, but that felt like abundance to someone who had grown up with nothing. A studio apartment in a decent part of town, a job as a mechanic that paid the bills, a small circle of friends who knew little about his past. It wasn't much, but it was his. The transition from ward of the state to independent adult had been brutal in ways Marcus never discussed. Those first months of freedom had also been months of fear. Sleeping on couches, working 2 minimum-wage jobs, learning through trial and painful error how credit cards could become quicksand. He'd made mistakes, accumulated debts, nearly ended up on the streets twice. The system that had raised him had also failed to prepare him for the world beyond its walls. But Marcus Reed was nothing if not adaptable. Survival was a skill he'd honed since childhood, and eventually he found his footing. Auto mechanics had been his salvation. A trade program offered through a community outreach center had revealed an innate talent for understanding engines. Machines made sense to him in a way people often didn't. They were logical, fixable, and when broken, the reason could always be found if you looked hard enough. Fire remained a constant in his life, though not in the way one might expect. The childhood fascination had evolved into something more profound. At 22, Marcus had joined the volunteer fire department, spending his weekends and evenings training, learning, and occasionally facing the very element that had shaped his existence. There was something poetic about it. The orphaned boy who had once braved flames alone now stood shoulder to shoulder with others who understood the delicate dance between destruction and salvation. His first real fire as a volunteer had nearly broken him. A family home, children trapped upstairs, parents frantic on the lawn. The memory of entering that smoke-filled hallway, oxygen tank heavy on his back, had triggered such a powerful flashback to the apartment fire that he'd frozen for precious seconds. His training partner, a veteran named Hector, had nudged him forward with a steady hand on his shoulder. "Stay with me, Reed," he'd said through the mask. "One step at a time." They'd saved the children, though the house had been a total loss. Later, shaking in the station shower, Marcus had vomited twice, the adrenaline crash hitting him like a physical blow. But he'd gone back the next week and the week after that. Some compulsions ran too deep to ignore. "Reed, you coming to Sullivan's after shift?" Marco called across the station as they hung up their gear after a routine call. A kitchen fire extinguished before it could claim more than a stove and some cabinetry. "Not tonight," Marcus replied, running a hand through his close-cropped hair. "Early start tomorrow at the shop." Marco shrugged, accustomed to Marcus's frequent declines. "Your loss? Donnie's bringing that friend of hers, the redhead from dispatch, the one who keeps asking about you." Marcus smiled but shook his head. "Give her my regrets." "Man, you're impossible." Marco laughed, slapping him on the shoulder. "Someday, you're gonna have to let people get close, you know." It was partly true. The auto repair shop where he worked full-time had a line of vehicles waiting for his attention. But there was more to his reluctance. Lately, something had been gnawing at him. A restlessness he couldn't name, as if he were waiting for something without knowing what. Dreams of fire had returned, more vivid than they'd been in years. In these dreams, he was back in that apartment building. But the corridors stretched endlessly, and the man he sought to save was always just beyond reach. He would wake gasping, his sheets damp with sweat, the phantom smell of smoke in his nostrils. His therapist, a luxury he'd only recently allowed himself, suggested the dreams might represent unresolved trauma, or perhaps a subconscious feeling that something in his life remained incomplete. Marcus wasn't convinced. Dr. Abernathy was well-meaning but had never quite grasped the complexities of his history. How could she? Marcus himself shared only carefully edited versions of his past, maintaining the protective barriers he'd built over decades. That night, alone in his apartment, Marcus scrolled through job listings on his laptop, a habit he'd developed recently without fully understanding why. His position at Rodriguez Auto was secure. Tony had even hinted at making him partners someday. Yet here he was, looking at opportunities in other cities, other states. Seattle, Denver, Chicago. Places where winter meant real snow, not the half-hearted sleet of his current southern home. His phone buzzed with a text from his girlfriend, Alicia. "Miss you. Call me tomorrow." They'd been dating for 6 months, the longest relationship he'd managed to sustain. Alicia was kind, smart, beautiful by anyone's standards. A pediatric nurse with an easy laugh and a collection of terrible jokes she inflicted on her young patients. She deserved more than the emotional walls Marcus had constructed over years of learning that attachment led to loss. He typed back a brief affirmative response, knowing he should feel more than this distant affection. The truth was, Marcus had been pulling away for weeks now, canceling plans, working late, creating distance in subtle ways that Alicia had begun to notice. Last weekend, she'd finally confronted him. "What are we doing, Marcus?" she'd asked, her voice soft but determined as they sat on her couch. A movie paused on the television between them. "Because it feels like I'm in this relationship alone lately." "I've been busy," he'd offered weakly, knowing it was insufficient. "It's more than that." Her eyes, usually warm, had been sad in a way that twisted something in his chest. "You don't let me in." "Not really. We've been together half a year, and I still know almost nothing about your life before we met." "There's not much to tell," he'd lied, the words familiar on his tongue. "See? That's exactly what I mean." She'd taken his hand then, her touch gentle but insistent. "Everyone has a story, Marcus. I've shared mine with you. All of it. The messy parts, the painful parts. But you, it's like you're a book with most of the pages torn out." He hadn't known how to respond. How could he explain that the pages weren't torn out but deliberately hidden? That the habit of privacy had become so ingrained, it felt like self-preservation. "I just need time," he'd finally said. Alicia had nodded, disappointment visible despite her attempt to hide it. "Time I can give you. But at some point you have to decide if you want a real partnership or just someone to keep the loneliness at bay." The conversation had ended there, unresolved. Now, staring at her text, Marcus felt the weight of decisions postponed. Outside his window, rain began to fall, drumming against the glass in an irregular rhythm. Marcus closed his laptop and moved to the small kitchenette to make tea. A habit he'd picked up from Mrs. Winters, the only foster parent who had shown him genuine kindness during his brief stay in her home. The familiar ritual calmed him, creating space for thoughts he usually kept at bay. What was he doing with his life? At 33, he had constructed an existence that was functional but somehow hollow. He had survived. Was that enough? The question lingered as he sipped his tea and watched raindrops trace jagged paths down the window pane. On his refrigerator, held by a magnet from a local pizza place, was a photo from last summer. A rare moment of unguarded happiness. The volunteer fire department's annual picnic, Marcus surrounded by his crew, laughing at something now forgotten. Marco with his arms slung around Marcus's shoulders. Chief Delaney flipping burgers in the background. A found family of sorts, though Marcus kept them at the same careful distance he maintained with everyone. Next to it hung a much older photo, its edges worn from handling. Marcus at 10 years old, standing between his parents outside their modest home. His mother's smile, his father's hand on his shoulder. The last photo taken before the drunk driver had destroyed his world. He'd kept it all these years, through foster homes and group facilities, a talisman of a life that sometimes felt like it had belonged to someone else. His phone rang, startling him from his reverie. Unknown number. Normally, Marcus let such calls go to voicemail. Too many bill collectors had hounded him in leaner times. But tonight, something compelled him to answer. Hello? Is this Marcus Reed? The voice was male, professional, unfamiliar. Yes. Who's this? My name is Daniel Kessler. I'm an attorney with Kessler, Brandt & Associates in Chicago. I'm calling regarding the estate of Edward Harrington. Do you have a moment to talk? Marcus frowned. The name meant nothing to him. I think you have the wrong person. I don't know any Edward Harrington. A pause. Mr. Reed, were you living at Pinewood Children's Home in November 2010? The question hit Marcus like a physical blow. Nobody asked about Pinewood. Nobody knew about those years unless he chose to share that information, which he rarely did. His grip tightened on the phone. Who did you say you were again? Marcus asked, tension creeping into his voice. Mr. Reed, I understand your caution. Mr. Harrington passed away 3 weeks ago. In his will, he was quite specific about locating a young man who saved his life during an apartment fire approximately 15 years ago. The description matches what we know about you. Marcus lowered himself onto the edge of his bed, memories flooding back with sudden clarity. The man in apartment 3C. The unconscious figure he dragged down 3 flights of stairs. The weight of him, the heat, the desperate struggle for air. How did you find me? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Harrington was thorough. He hired private investigators over the years. It took time, but eventually they traced the story back to Pinewood, where a staff member recalled your nightmares about the fire. From there, it was a matter of following your trail. Marcus's mind raced. 15 years of silence. And now this call from a stranger about a man he'd saved but never met. Not properly. A man who had apparently spent years looking for him. The thought was both touching and unsettling. Someone had been searching while Marcus had been oblivious, building his careful, contained life. What does this have to do with me now? Why contact me after all this time? The attorney cleared his throat. Mr. Reed, Edward Harrington died a wealthy man. He had no family, no children. His will is quite clear. The bulk of his estate is to go to the young man who saved his life that night. What are you saying? Marcus asked, though a part of him already knew. I'm saying, Mr. Reed, that you are the primary beneficiary of Mr. Harrington's will. We need you to come to Chicago as soon as possible to discuss the details. All expenses will be covered, of course. Marcus stood, moving to the window as if physical motion could help process the attorney's words. Outside, the rain had intensified, sheets of water now obscuring the view of the street below. A crack of thunder shook the building. This doesn't make sense, he finally said. Why would he? I was just a kid. I didn't even know his name until now. Mr. Harrington was a complicated man, Kessler replied, his tone softening slightly. He lived a solitary life, especially in his later years. But he was adamant about finding you. In his personal papers, he referred to you as the boy who walked through fire. He believed he owed you a debt that could never truly be repaid. Marcus pressed his forehead against the cool glass of the window. The boy who walked through fire. The phrase sent a shiver down his spine, as if someone had finally seen a truth about him that he himself had never fully articulated. "What if I don't want it?" Marcus asked, the question surprising even himself. "His money, I mean." "That would be your choice, of course," Kessler replied carefully. "But Mr. Harrington anticipated your reluctance. He left a letter for you to be delivered in person. He was quite insistent about that part." A letter. Words from beyond the grave. From a man whose life had intersected with his own in the most dramatic way possible, yet who remained a stranger. Marcus felt a pull of curiosity that overrode his initial wariness. "When would I need to come to Chicago?" "At your earliest convenience. As I mentioned, all expenses would be covered. Mr. Harrington was quite explicit about that." Marcus thought about his life here. The job at Rodriguez Auto, his volunteer shifts at the fire station, Alicia waiting for decisions he couldn't seem to make. The restlessness that had plagued him for months. Perhaps this unexpected development was the change he'd been unconsciously seeking. "I could probably get away next weekend," he said, surprising himself with the decision. "I'd need to arrange things at work." "Excellent. I'll have my assistant contact you with flight details and hotel arrangements. We can schedule the reading of the relevant portions of the will for Monday morning, if that suits you." The rain continued its steady rhythm against the window as Marcus sat in stunned silence, the phone pressed to his ear. The universe, it seemed, had finally decided to cash in on that long-ago night when an orphaned boy had run into flames instead of away from them. "Mr. Reed, are you still there?" "Yes," Marcus said, watching as a single lightning bolt split the night sky. "I'm still here." After ending the call, Marcus stood motionless in his apartment, listening to the storm outside and the equally tumultuous thoughts within. He should feel something more definite. Excitement, perhaps, or at least curiosity about this unexpected inheritance. Instead, he felt strangely hollow, as if standing at the edge of a precipice he hadn't known was there. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Alicia. "Everything okay? You seemed distant earlier." Marcus stared at the message, fingers hovering over the keyboard. What could he possibly say? That a ghost from his past had suddenly materialized? That he was flying to Chicago to meet with lawyers about an inheritance from a man he'd saved and then forgotten? That his carefully constructed life suddenly felt like a temporary shelter rather than a permanent home? "Just tired," he typed instead. "Talk tomorrow." He set the phone down and moved to his closet, pulling out the small fireproof box he kept on the top shelf. Inside were the few documents and mementos he'd accumulated through his life. Birth certificate, social security card, his parents' death certificates, a few photographs, his mother's wedding ring. And at the bottom, folded and refolded so many times, the creases had begun to tear. A newspaper clipping from 15 years ago. "Local businessman survives apartment fire," the headline read. The article was brief, mentioning Edward Harrington, 45, who had been rescued by an unidentified Good Samaritan before firefighters arrived on scene. Marcus had found the clipping weeks after the incident, had kept it all these years without fully understanding why. Now he knew. Some part of him had always sensed that night wasn't truly over, that the story had been paused rather than completed. What he didn't say, what he couldn't possibly know, was that Edward Harrington's legacy would be far more than money. It would be a door opening to a past Marcus had never known existed and a future he could never have imagined. The plane descended through cloud cover, revealing Chicago's sprawling cityscape below. Marcus pressed his forehead against the small window, watching as the metropolis took shape, a vast network of streets, buildings, and the glittering expanse of Lake Michigan stretching to the horizon. He'd never been to Chicago before, had never been on a plane before, for that matter. His life had been circumscribed by practicalities and limited means, making this journey feel surreal on multiple levels. The attorney, Kessler, had arranged everything with an efficiency that left Marcus slightly uncomfortable. First-class ticket, car service waiting at the airport, reservation at a downtown hotel that probably cost more per night than Marcus's monthly rent. The casual display of wealth was foreign territory, and Marcus found himself reflexively checking price tags, mentally calculating costs. "First time in Chicago?" the driver asked as they pulled away from O'Hare, Marcus's single duffel bag looking pathetically inadequate in the spacious trunk of the town car. "That obvious, huh?" Marcus replied, trying to appear more at ease than he felt. "You've got that look, taking everything in." The driver smiled in the rearview mirror. The windy city has that effect on people. Marcus nodded, turning his attention back to the window. The highway gave way to city streets, buildings growing taller, traffic more congested. He'd done some research before the trip, reading about Edward Harrington online. The articles painted a picture of a successful real estate developer who had built a modest empire of commercial properties throughout the Midwest. Self-made, respected in business circles, philanthropic but intensely private. No mention of family, no interviews that revealed anything personal, just business achievements and charitable donations. What kind of man spends 15 years searching for the stranger who saved him? And what kind of man leaves his fortune to that stranger? The questions had circled in Marcus's mind for days, along with a more unsettling one. Why had Marcus himself never tried to discover what happened to the man he'd rescued? The hotel was exactly as intimidating as Marcus had feared. All marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and staff who somehow intuited he didn't belong before he'd even opened his mouth. The room, however, offered blessed privacy. Marcus dropped his bag on the luggage rack and stood at the window, taking in the panoramic view of the city and lake beyond. His phone buzzed with a text from Alicia. "Landed safely. Hotel okay." He'd finally told her about the trip, though not the full reason behind it. Just a vague explanation about an unexpected inheritance matter that required his presence in Chicago. She'd been supportive but confused, clearly sensing he was withholding information. Another brick in the wall between them. "All good," he texted back. "Meeting with lawyer tomorrow morning." There was a knock at the door. Room service he hadn't ordered. A bottle of expensive scotch with a note from Kessler. "Thought you might appreciate this after your journey. Looking forward to our meeting tomorrow. 10 a.m. my office. The car will collect you at 9:30. Marcus set the bottle aside, unopened. He wasn't much of a drinker, had seen too many foster parents disappear into bottles, too many kids at Pinewood whose lives had been shattered by parents who chose alcohol over responsibility. Instead, he ordered a sandwich from the room service menu, wincing at the price but reminding himself it wasn't his money being spent. That night, sleep eluded him. The bed was too soft, the room too quiet without the familiar sounds of his apartment building. Around 2 a.m., he gave up and dressed, heading down to the deserted hotel lobby and out into the night. The doorman gave him a curious look, but didn't comment as Marcus stepped onto the sidewalk. Chicago at night was alive in a way his smaller hometown never was. Pockets of activity, even in the early morning hours. Lights blazing from office buildings where people worked through the night, taxis cruising for fares. The wind that gave the city its nickname whipped down the artificial canyons created by skyscrapers, carrying the scent of the lake. Marcus walked without direction, hands in his pockets, thoughts churning. Tomorrow would change things. He sensed that with a certainty that defied explanation. Whatever Edward Harrington had left him, whatever message waited in that letter, it represented a disruption to the careful equilibrium he'd maintained for years. Was he ready for that? Did he even want it? By the time he returned to the hotel, the sky was beginning to lighten with pre-dawn gray. He showered, dressed in the one good outfit he'd packed. Dark jeans, button-down shirt, the blazer he wore to the occasional restaurant dinner with Alicia. Not proper business attire, but the best he could manage on short notice. At precisely 9:30, the car arrived. At 9:55, Marcus found himself in the elevator of a downtown office building, ascending to the 47th floor where Kessler, Brandt, and Associates occupied a corner suite with views that made even the hotels seem modest by comparison. Mr. Reed. The receptionist smiled with professional warmth. Mr. Kessler is expecting you. Can I offer you coffee? Water? Coffee, please. Black. His mouth felt suddenly dry. The conference room they led him to was intimidating in its understated luxury. Gleaming table, leather chairs, floor-to-ceiling windows. Daniel Kessler rose as Marcus entered. A man in his 60s with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to wealth and its management. Mr. Reed, thank you for coming on such short notice. His handshake was firm, his assessment swift but not unkind. I hope your accommodations are satisfactory? More than satisfactory, Marcus replied, taking the offered seat. Thank you. Excellent. Kessler settled across from him, opening a leather portfolio. I know you must have questions, so let me begin by explaining the situation as clearly as possible. Over the next 30 minutes, Kessler outlined Edward Harrington's estate in clinical terms. Properties in 4 states, investment portfolios, art collections, charitable foundations. The numbers were abstract in their enormity, millions upon millions that Marcus could barely conceptualize. And he left all of this to me? Marcus finally interrupted, unable to process what he was hearing. Not all, Kessler corrected. There are substantial bequests to various charities. His household staff has been provided for. But yes, Mr. Reed, you are the primary beneficiary. The bulk of the estate, approximately 85%, is now yours. Marcus stood abruptly, moving to the window. Below, Chicago continued its Monday morning routine, oblivious to the fact that his world was shifting on its axis. I don't understand, he said finally. Why me? One night, 15 years ago. That's not a reason to leave someone a fortune. Kessler was quiet for a moment. Mr. Harrington was a complex man, private, as I mentioned. But that night changed him profoundly. After the fire, he became different, more philanthropic, more concerned with legacy. He reached into his portfolio and withdrew an envelope. He left this for you. Perhaps it will provide the answers I cannot. The envelope was heavy cream stationery, Marcus's name written in an elegant, slanting script. He took it with unsteady fingers. Would you like some privacy? Kessler asked. Marcus nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. Take all the time you need. I'll be in my office when you're ready to continue our discussion. When the door closed behind the attorney, Marcus sank back into his chair, the envelope heavy in his hands. Whatever was written inside represented Edward Harrington's final communication, words chosen with the knowledge they would outlive him. With a deep breath, Marcus broke the seal and unfolded the letter within. Dear Marcus, If you are reading this, then my search has finally succeeded, though I am no longer here to witness it. I have imagined this moment countless times over the years. What I might say to the boy who walked through fire to save a stranger. What words could possibly convey the debt I owe you? You won't remember, but I woke briefly as the paramedics were working on me. Through the haze of smoke inhalation and pain, I saw you, a thin boy with determined eyes, slipping away into the crowd before anyone could recognize what you had done. In that moment, I knew I had been granted something precious and unearned. A second chance. The fire should have been the end of my story. I had made arrangements for such an eventuality. Tidy bequests to impersonal charities, my affairs in perfect order. I had lived a life focused on acquisition and achievement, with little thought to purpose or meaning. I had no family, few friends, nothing that truly mattered. But you changed that calculus with your inexplicable courage. You risked everything for someone you didn't know, would never meet. Why? This question has haunted me for 15 years. What makes a child, for you were just a child then, run toward danger rather than away from it? I have lived these borrowed years differently because of you. I have tried to be worthy of the sacrifice you made, the risk you took. And I have searched for you, needing to understand, needing to thank you, needing somehow to balance the cosmic scales. What I offer you now is not charity or gratitude, though both elements exist. It is something more fundamental: recognition. You are seen, Marcus Reed. Your act of courage did not go unnoticed or unrewarded, even if the acknowledgement comes belatedly. I have instructed Daniel to provide you with all necessary assistance in managing your inheritance. You may, of course, decline it, though I hope you will not. Not because I wish to burden you with wealth, but because I believe you will use it wisely, perhaps more wisely than I did for much of my life. There is one more thing, something I discovered during my search for you that you should know. But that information is not contained in this letter. Instead, I have left it in the place where our paths first crossed. The key enclosed will open the door to apartment 3C at 1420 Westbrook Avenue. What waits for you there is perhaps more valuable than all the material wealth I leave behind. With profound gratitude for the life you saved, Edward Harrington. A small key had been taped to the bottom of the letter. Ordinary, unremarkable, except for what it might unlock. Marcus read the letter twice more, emotions churning. Gratitude he could understand. Even the inheritance, excessive as it seemed, had a certain logic to it. But the cryptic reference to information waiting at the apartment building, that sent a chill down his spine. What could Edward Harrington possibly have discovered about him? And why leave it there at the site of the fire rather than simply including it in the letter? There was only one way to find out. When Kessler returned to the conference room 20 minutes later, he found Marcus standing at the window, letter folded carefully in his pocket, decision made. "Mr. Kessler," Marcus said without preamble, "I need to visit an address before we discuss anything further. 1420 Westbrook Avenue. Is that building still standing?" If the attorney was surprised by the request, he didn't show it. "Yes, it was renovated after the fire. Mr. Harrington actually purchased the building several years ago. It's part of your inheritance now." Of course it was. Marcus almost laughed at the cosmic irony. "Can you arrange transportation? There's something I need to see there." "Certainly. I'll have the car brought around immediately." Kessler paused, studying Marcus with newfound interest. "He said you would ask about the building. He said it would be the first thing you'd want to know." Marcus met the older man's gaze. He seems to have known me better than I knew myself. Mr. Harrington had a gift for seeing beneath the surface, Kessler replied. It made him successful in business and insightful in other matters. An hour later, Marcus stood on the sidewalk outside 1420 Westbrook Avenue, staring up at the renovated facade. The building looked nothing like his memories, the exterior now sleek and modern, the entrance redesigned with glass doors and security features. The key felt heavy in his palm as he approached the entrance, nodding to the doorman who seemed to be expecting him. The elevator ride to the third floor was a journey through time as much as space, memories flooding back with each passing second. The heat, the smoke, the weight of Edward Harrington's unconscious body. Apartment 3C looked like any other door in the hallway, unmarked by the drama that had unfolded there 15 years earlier. Marcus stood before it, key in hand, heart racing with an anxiety he couldn't fully name. Whatever waited on the other side of this door represented the final communication from a man who had spent years searching for him. A man who believed he had discovered something about Marcus that Marcus himself didn't know. With a deep breath, Marcus inserted the key and turned it, stepping across the threshold into a past he thought he'd left behind and a future he couldn't yet imagine. The apartment door swung open silently, revealing a space that bore no resemblance to the smoke-filled inferno of Marcus's memories. The renovations had transformed it completely. Open floor plan, modern furnishings, walls painted in soft neutrals. For a moment, Marcus wondered if he'd somehow entered the wrong unit. But the key had turned, and the number on the door was unmistakable. 3C. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The apartment appeared unlived in, but not abandoned. No dust on surfaces, no stale air. Maintained, waiting, for him. "Hello," he called out, though he knew no one would answer. Sunlight streamed through large windows, illuminating a living room that flowed into a kitchen area. No personal items were visible, no photographs, no mail, nothing to indicate who might have occupied the space. It felt like a stage set, arranged for a play that hadn't yet begun. On the kitchen island sat a single item, a manila envelope with his name written on it in the same elegant script as the letter. Marcus approached slowly, heart pounding. This was it. Whatever Harrington had discovered, whatever he believed Marcus should know. The envelope was sealed, but not glued. Inside, Marcus found a thin file folder and a handwritten note on the same heavy stationery. "Marcus, the enclosed documents represent the culmination of years of searching, not just for you, but for answers that might explain the extraordinary courage you displayed that night. What I discovered may be difficult to process. For that, I apologize. But I believe you deserve to know the truth, however complicated it may be. The choice of what to do with this information is entirely yours. My attorneys have been instructed to provide whatever resources you might need to pursue this further, or to walk away, if that is your preference. With respect, Edward Harrington Marcus set the note aside and opened the folder with trembling fingers. Inside were several documents, arranged chronologically. The first was a newspaper clipping from 28 years ago, a brief article about a house fire in a small town 3 states away. The headline read, "Local family perishes in tragic fire. Child survives." His eyes scanned the text, breath catching at the details. A family of 3, parents and a 5-year-old daughter, had died when their home caught fire in the middle of the night. Miraculously, their 3-year-old son had survived, found by firefighters in the backyard, apparently having climbed out a window. The boy's name was listed as Thomas Elliot. Marcus frowned, confused. What did this decades-old tragedy have to do with him? He turned to the next document, a copy of a child services report. The surviving boy, Thomas, had been placed in foster care after the fire. No relatives had come forward to claim him. The third document made Marcus's knees buckle. He sank onto a nearby stool, staring at a photocopy of an adoption record. Thomas Elliott had been adopted at age 4 by Michael and Sarah Reed. They had renamed him Marcus. The room seemed to tilt around him as implications cascaded through his mind. The parents he remembered, the ones who had died in the car accident when he was 8. They weren't his birth parents. Before them, there had been another family, another tragedy, another fire. His hands shook as he turned to the final document, a DNA test result comparing samples from Thomas Elliott's surviving relatives, a maternal aunt, with what appeared to be Marcus's own DNA. The match was conclusive. 25% shared genetic material consistent with an aunt-nephew relationship. But how had Harrington obtained his DNA? The question flashed through Marcus's mind, followed immediately by the realization, the empty water bottle from their meeting yesterday. The hotel room's drinking glasses, any number of opportunities for someone with resources and determination. Ethically questionable, yes, but effective. Marcus set the papers down, mind reeling. He'd spent his life believing he was Marcus Reed, son of Michael and Sarah, orphaned at 8 in a car accident. Now, documents arranged by a dead man told him he was actually Thomas Elliott, survivor of an earlier tragedy, adopted and renamed. A twice-orphaned child, a boy who had survived not 1 but 2 catastrophic losses before he was even 10 years old. And fires, always fires. The coincidence seemed too perfect, too neat. That he would survive a fire as a toddler only to run into another burning building 15 years later to save Edward Harrington. What were the odds? Unless it wasn't coincidence at all. Unless something deeper, more primal had driven him into that apartment building. Some buried memory, some unresolved trauma seeking resolution. Marcus, or Thomas, he wasn't sure which name to use even in his own thoughts, moved to the window, staring out at the Chicago skyline without really seeing it. The apartment suddenly felt too small, the walls closing in with revelations he wasn't prepared to process. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from Kessler. "Take all the time you need. Car will wait." Time. He needed time to absorb this, to understand what it meant for his past and his future, to decide who he was now, with this new knowledge layered atop the identity he'd constructed. Marcus gathered the documents, returning them to the envelope with careful movements that belied the chaos in his mind. Whatever else happened, he wouldn't leave them behind. These fragments of a history he'd never known were now his to examine, to accept or reject. As he moved toward the door, something made him pause, an inexplicable feeling that there was more to discover. The apartment was sparsely furnished, offering few places to hide additional information. But something about the bedroom doorway caught his attention. Inside, the room was as impersonal as the rest of the apartment. Bed made with hotel precision, nightstand empty save for a lamp. But on the wall opposite the door hung a single framed photograph. Marcus approached slowly, breath catching as the image came into focus. A family portrait, mother, father, young daughter, and a toddler with familiar eyes. His eyes, the Elliots, his first family. Beneath the frame, mounted on a small shelf, sat a tarnished metal toy fire truck. The sight of it triggered something. Not quite a memory, more a feeling. Recognition, familiarity. Had it been his? A cherished toy from a life he couldn't remember? With trembling fingers, Marcus lifted the truck, turning it over in his hands. On the bottom, scratched in childish letters, T.E. Thomas Elliot. His name, his original name. The toy felt right in his hand, like reuniting with a piece of himself, long missing. Without conscious thought, Marcus slipped it into his pocket alongside the envelope of documents. As he left the apartment, locking the door behind him, Marcus knew with certainty that his life had irrevocably changed. The careful boundaries he'd constructed, the walls he'd built to contain his past and protect himself from further loss, they couldn't withstand this new knowledge. In the elevator, descending to where Kessler's car waited, Marcus made a decision. He wouldn't return to the law office today. He needed space, time to process what he'd learned, and he needed to begin his own investigation, to verify independently what Harrington had discovered, to fill in the gaps in this newly revealed history. Most of all, he needed to understand why. Why Harrington had gone to such lengths to uncover this information, and why it had been so important to him that Marcus know the truth. As the elevator doors opened to the lobby, Marcus stepped out a different man than the one who had entered the building an hour earlier. A man with two names, two histories, and questions that stretched back to a fire he couldn't remember, but that had apparently shaped his entire existence. The toy fire truck weighed heavy in his pocket, a tangible connection to a past he would now have to reclaim, one piece at a time. 3 days later, Marcus sat in a rental car outside a modest ranch house in Oak Ridge, Illinois, a small town 2 hours from Chicago that he'd never heard of until this week. According to the documents Harrington had compiled, this was where it had all begun, where Thomas Elliot had been born, where the first fire had claimed his family, where his original life had ended and the path to becoming Marcus Reed had started. The town was exactly what he'd expected. Main Street with requisite diner, hardware store, and post office. Neighborhoods of aging homes with well-kept lawns. Water tower visible in the distance, bearing the town name in faded paint. Americana distilled to its essence. Marcus had called Kessler from his hotel room the morning after discovering the documents, explaining that he needed time before discussing the inheritance further. The attorney had been understanding, even helpful, providing access to funds for Marcus's impromptu investigation without pressing for details. Harrington's instructions, apparently, had been explicit. Give Marcus whatever he needed to process this information. The house before him now belonged to Eleanor Winters. His maternal aunt, according to the DNA test, his mother's sister. The woman who, for reasons unknown, hadn't claimed her orphan nephew after the fire. The last living link to the family he couldn't remember. Marcus had called ahead, identifying himself only as someone researching the Elliot family history. Ms. Winters had agreed to meet, her voice cautious but not unwelcoming on the phone. Now, sitting in the car, Marcus rehearsed what he would say, how much he would reveal. The truth seemed too abrupt, too dramatic. Hello, I'm the nephew you thought died 25 years ago. With a deep breath, he exited the car and approached the front door. Before he could knock, it opened, revealing a woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked auburn hair and eyes that immediately struck him as familiar. The same shape as his own, the same deep blue color. You must be Mr. Reed, she said, offering a polite smile. Please come in. The interior of the house was neat and comfortable. Furniture slightly outdated but well-maintained, walls lined with bookshelves and family photographs. Marcus followed her to a living room where tea had been set out on a coffee table. The domestic normalcy of the scene at odds with the tumult of his emotions. You mentioned on the phone you're researching the Elliot family? Eleanor prompted as she poured tea into delicate cups that looked like they were reserved for special occasions. Yes. Marcus replied, accepting the offered cup with a steadiness that surprised him. Specifically, I'm interested in the family that lived here in Oak Ridge. Robert and Catherine Elliott, and their children. Something flickered across Eleanor's face, a shadow of old grief. That would be my sister's family. They died in a house fire many years ago. It was a terrible tragedy. All of them? Marcus asked quietly, watching her reaction closely. Eleanor's hand stilled on her teacup. Yes, Catherine, Robert, their daughter Emma, and their son Thomas. She paused, studying him with sudden intensity. Why are you really here, Mr. Reed? This isn't academic research, is it? The moment of truth had arrived sooner than Marcus had anticipated. He set his untouched tea aside and met her gaze directly. No, it's not. Ms. Winters, I recently discovered something about my past that led me here. Something that suggests I might be... He faltered, the words suddenly difficult to form. That I might be Thomas Elliott. Eleanor's face drained of color. The teacup in her hand clattered against its saucer as she set it down with trembling fingers. That's impossible, she whispered. Thomas died in the fire. They all did. The newspaper article says the boy survived. Marcus countered gently. Found in the backyard, having escaped through a window. There was a mistake, Eleanor said, her voice gaining strength. They found a body later, in the debris. A child's body. They told me it was Thomas. I identified... She broke off, pressing a hand to her mouth. I identified what they said were his remains. Marcus hadn't expected this. The documents Harrington had provided indicated Thomas had survived, had entered the foster system. There had been no mention of misidentified remains or conflicting reports. I'm sorry, he said, genuinely distressed at having upset her. I didn't know. The information I have must be incorrect. Eleanor stood abruptly, moving to a bookshelf where she retrieved a photo album. Her movements were jerky, agitated, as she returned to the couch and flipped through pages with determined focus. Here, she said, turning the album toward him. This is Thomas, my nephew. The photograph showed a smiling toddler with dark hair and blue eyes, sitting on a lawn with a toy fire truck clutched in his hands. The same truck that now resided in Marcus's hotel room, retrieved from apartment 3C. Marcus stared at the image, a strange vertigo sweeping over him. The child in the photograph could have been him at that age. The resemblance was undeniable. May I? He asked, reaching for the album. Eleanor nodded, watching him intently as he examined more photos. Thomas as an infant in his mother's arms. Thomas with his older sister building a sandcastle. Thomas blowing out candles on his 3rd birthday cake, the last birthday he would celebrate. When was the fire? Marcus asked quietly. April 17th, 1992. Eleanor replied without hesitation. 2 months after Thomas turned 3. Marcus calculated quickly. That aligned with what he knew of his own timeline. If Thomas had survived, been placed in foster care, then adopted by the Reeds a year later, the dates worked. Ms. Winters, he said carefully, I was adopted when I was 4 years old by a couple named Michael and Sarah Reed. Before that, I was in foster care. I don't have memories from before the adoption, at least none that are clear. But recently, I've discovered evidence suggesting I might have been born Thomas Elliott. Eleanor's expression shifted from skepticism to a fragile, trembling hope. What evidence? Marcus hesitated, then reached into his pocket and withdrew the toy fire truck. This was in an apartment in Chicago, along with documents about the fire, about Thomas entering foster care, about the adoption. He placed the truck on the coffee table between them. It has initials scratched on the bottom. T.E. With shaking hands, Eleanor picked up the truck, turning it over to examine the childish scratches. Her eyes filled with tears. "I gave him this," she whispered, "for his 3rd birthday. He carried it everywhere." She looked up at Marcus, really seeing him now. "You have Catherine's eyes, and Robert's chin." Her voice broke. "How is this possible? They told me he was dead. I buried him." "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "That's part of why I'm here, to understand what happened." Eleanor set the truck down and reached for his face with tentative fingers, as if he might disappear at her touch. "May I?" Marcus nodded, allowing this stranger who might be his aunt to cradle his face in her hands, to search his features for traces of the family he couldn't remember. "There was a birthmark," she said suddenly. "Thomas had a small birthmark on his right shoulder blade, like a crescent moon." Marcus felt a chill run through him. The birthmark was there, had always been there, something no one could have known from photographs or documents. "It's there," he confirmed quietly. Eleanor's composure crumbled. She withdrew her hands and covered her face, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Marcus sat awkwardly, uncertain how to comfort this woman who was simultaneously a stranger and his closest living relative. After several minutes, Eleanor collected herself, wiping tears with a tissue from her pocket. "I'm sorry. This is overwhelming." "For me too," Marcus assured her. "How did you find out, after all these years?" Marcus explained about Edward Harrington, the fire 15 years ago, the inheritance, and the documents left in apartment 3C. As he spoke, Eleanor's expression shifted from shock to anger. "Someone knew," she said when he finished. "Someone knew Thomas, you, had survived, and they let me believe you were dead. Let me bury what I thought were your remains. Let you grow up without family." Her voice hardened. "I want to know who and why." The question resonated with Marcus's own growing suspicion that there was more to this story than a simple clerical error or case of mistaken identity. The coincidence was too great. That he would survive one fire only to run into another 15 years later and save Edward Harrington. That Harrington would then spend years tracking down his rescuer only to discover this buried history. "The remains you identified," Marcus asked carefully. "Do you remember anything specific about that process?" Eleanor's brow furrowed in concentration. It was chaotic. The fire had been devastating. They told me they found what they believed were Thomas's remains in what had been his bedroom. They showed me fragments, a partial dental record. She shuddered at the memory. I was grief-stricken, not thinking clearly. I accepted what they told me. "Who told you? The police?" "The fire investigator," Eleanor replied. "A man named Garrett, James Garrett. He handled the case." Marcus made a mental note of the name. "And there was never any suggestion that Thomas might have survived? No reports of a child being found in the yard?" Eleanor shook her head slowly. "No. Nothing like that." Her eyes narrowed. "You think this wasn't a mistake? You think it was deliberate?" "I don't know what to think," Marcus admitted. "But it seems convenient that a child survives a fire but is reported dead, then ends up in foster care with no connection to his past. But why? What possible reason could anyone have?" Marcus had been asking himself the same question since discovering the documents. "I don't know, but I intend to find out." Eleanor studied him with new intensity. "You look so much like her, like Catherine, my sister." Fresh tears welled in her eyes. I missed so many years. Your whole life. Tell me about them, Marcus said suddenly. My parents. My sister. What were they like? For the next 2 hours, Eleanor shared stories and photographs, reconstructing the family Marcus had lost before he could form lasting memories of them. Catherine Elliott, his mother, had been a kindergarten teacher, beloved in the community. Robert, his father, had run the local hardware store, was known for his generosity with customers who couldn't afford repairs. Emma, his sister, had been 7 when she died. A serious child with a talent for drawing and a protective attitude toward her little brother. As Eleanor spoke, Marcus felt a strange doubling of identity. He was both Marcus Reed, the man who had constructed a life from the ashes of multiple tragedies, and Thomas Elliott, the boy who should have grown up in this small town with this family, whose path had been violently diverted by fire and apparent deception. What happens now? Eleanor asked finally, the afternoon light fading outside her windows. Will you take a DNA test to confirm? I already did, Marcus replied. That was part of what Harrington left me. The results matched your DNA, a 25% relation, consistent with an aunt. Eleanor nodded slowly. So you are Thomas, my nephew. She reached for his hand, holding it between both of hers. I would have taken you in, you know. If I'd known you were alive, I would have raised you. I believe you, Marcus said, and was surprised to find he meant it. There was an earnestness to Eleanor that couldn't be faked. Will you stay? She asked. Just for a few days. There's so much to talk about. So much I want to know about your life. Marcus hesitated. He had planned to visit the local records office, to see the site of the original fire, to perhaps track down this fire investigator, Garrett. Staying with Eleanor hadn't been part of the plan. But something in her expression, hope mingled with fear of renewed loss, made the decision for him. Yes, he said. I'd like that. That evening, Marcus called Alicia from the guest bedroom Eleanor had insisted he use. He'd been avoiding her calls and texts, unsure how to explain what was happening. But now, with the weight of discoveries pressing on him, he needed to hear her voice. Marcus? She answered on the first ring, relief and hurt mingling in her tone. Are you okay? I've been worried sick. I'm sorry, he said, meaning it. Things have been complicated here. What's going on? You've barely communicated for days. Marcus took a deep breath. I found out something about myself, about my past. It's a lot to process. Tell me, she said simply. So he did. All of it. Harrington's letter, the documents in apartment 3C, the discovery of his original identity, finding Eleanor. As he spoke, the story spilling out in a torrent of words, Marcus realized how desperately he had needed to share this burden with someone who knew him as Marcus Reed, who could anchor him to that identity even as he explored his origins as Thomas Elliott. When he finished, Alicia was quiet for a long moment. That's incredible, she finally said. Are you okay? The question, so simple yet so profound, broke something open in Marcus. I don't know, he admitted, voice cracking. I don't know who I am anymore. You're the same person you were a week ago, Alicia said firmly. You just know more about your history now. It doesn't change who you've become. Doesn't it, though? Everything I thought I knew about myself is based on a lie. Not everything, she countered. Your experiences, your choices, the man you've grown into, those are real. Your name might have been different once, but you're still you. Her words provided a measure of comfort, a perspective Marcus hadn't been able to find on his own. I miss you, he said, surprising himself with the admission. I miss you too. Do you want me to come there? I can take a few days off work. The offer was tempting. To have Alicia here, a tangible connection to his life as Marcus. But something held him back. Not yet. I need to figure some things out first, to understand what happened back then and why. Okay, she said, disappointment evident, but acceptance there too. But don't shut me out, all right? Whatever you discover, whatever you decide, I'm here. I know, Marcus said, and for the first time in days, felt something like solid ground beneath his feet. Thank you. After ending the call, Marcus stood at the guest room window, looking out at the unfamiliar street in this town that should have been his hometown. Somewhere nearby were the remains of the house where the Elliots had died, where Thomas had somehow survived, only to be declared dead. Tomorrow, he would begin searching for answers about the fire, about the investigator named Garrett, about how and why a 3-year-old boy had disappeared from his own life. But tonight, in this house with his mother's sister sleeping down the hall, Marcus allowed himself to feel the weight of all he had lost. The parents he couldn't remember, the sister he never knew, the life that had been stolen from him twice over. Not just by fire, but by deliberate human action. Someone had made a decision 25 years ago that had altered the course of his existence. Someone had looked at a traumatized 3-year-old boy and chosen to sever him from his past, his family, his very identity. Marcus intended to discover who and why, and in doing so, perhaps find a way to reconcile Thomas Elliot with Marcus Reed, to forge a single identity from these fractured pieces of himself.